Sally, thanks very much. And as you say, a very warm welcome to everybody who's joined us this afternoon. We're really excited to bring you our Happy Hour series for this autumn winter. We've got a selection of sessions starting from today right through till the 20th of December. They're all on our events page. And while actually not all of them, some of them we've held back, but we're really great that we're able to kick off today. And can I also just extend a real big thanks to Appello, TSA and the University of Sheffield for making their time available today to present. We've got three fantastic presenters who are going to look at this issue around the digital telecare. The title of today's session is also the title of a new policy briefing paper from Appello in association with the HousingLIN, and Tim Barclay, the chief exec of Appello, will share the findings from that and run you through that paper. But we're also delighted to be joined by two other speakers who I know very well evolve, and we're still working closely with both Steve Sadler, Head of Technology Strategy at the Tech Services Association, or the TSA for short, and many of you will know that we're working collaboratively with the TSA on a Dunhill Medical Trust funded project, the HAPPI programme, the Technology for an Ageing Population. And it's really nice to have Kate back with the LIN. Kate Hamlin, I think previously you were at the University of Oxford. You've changed universities. I hope you had a good transfer fee. You're now at the University of Sheffield, and we've got a long history working closely with the University of Sheffield around issues relating to housing and care. And I know you and Steve and I sit on a number of project boards, and we're going to hear a little bit about your work around the Centre for Care, as well as Steve's work at the TSA looking at issues around risk. So, setting the context for today, we've recently had the Appello briefing that was published last week, and earlier this month, the 6 test beds for the technology test beds for TAPPI were announced. So this is really all hot off the press, and I think this session is a really great one to kick off our Happy Hour series. In fact, perhaps we should have called it Tappy Hour for this one occasion. But anyway, enough of my jokes. I'm going to pass over to Tim. So Tim, a warm welcome to you, and thanks again for all your support.
You are very welcome, Jeremy, and thanks as always for you and the organisation's leadership in the sector in terms of working out where the focus areas are that you need to galvanise enthusiasm and awareness around. So hi everybody. For those who haven't met me before, my name's Tim Barclay. I'm the CEO and have had that privilege for the last 5.5 years or so of Appello. And if you're not familiar with Appello, we are the UK's largest telecare monitoring provider and also the leading provider of digital technology-enabled care solutions in the UK, fully end-to-end digital. Nobody's deployed more than us and or answered as many calls from us. So it does give us, I think, a very healthy perspective on where the UK is in its analog to digital transition. And just by way of context, if I think back to 2017, which, I mean, 5 years ago now, we did another report in association with the HousingLIN in terms of attitude towards digital telecare. And at that stage, more than half of the respondents, and there were well over 100 of them, were actively planning to move to digital. And 84% saw that digital technologies were a critical enabler for success for them in the future. So you would have thought on the backdrop of that, we would be pretty much fully digital telecare and technology enabled care services via digital in the UK 5 years. And so many organisations were already enthused about it and saw it as important towards their success. And yet the reality appears to be a little different. So Openreach, who, as I hope all of you are aware, are the UK's underlying infrastructure provider for the vast majority of the network that both BT, that Sky, that TalkTalk, that Virgin Media, for those elements that those other telcos don't provide themselves. Openreach are the underlying provider, and I was on a call with TalkTalk earlier on today, hearing about their plans to transition to digital where they aren't already, because a lot of their network already is digital. And it's very, very clear that despite Openreach's long-standing notification to the sector that they were retiring the analog network in 2025 and transitioning to digital in the intervening years, there is still an awful lot that needs to be done. Roughly 176 alarm receiving centres by Openreach's quantification exist in the UK, serving somewhere between 1.8 and 2 million alarms, analog telecare alarms. And yet of those 176 ARCs, roughly 110 of them still only have the capability to monitor analog alarms, analog calls, which in itself is a slightly nerve-wracking statistic. Add to that only 5% or so of those 1 million plus dispersed alarms are genuinely digital, and add to that the fact that there are circa 25,000 blocks of retirement accommodation, so not care homes or nursing homes, but dedicated retirement property in the UK. And of those, by best estimates, maybe 1,000, maximum 2,000 of those 25,000 have been converted to digital at this stage. That is an awful lot of ground to be made up between now and the end of 2025. Made even more pertinent by Openreach's own views, which are shared there on the right-hand side from their newsletter, that it is, in their experience of testing, there are uncertainties, even using analog to digital conversion, about whether calls can 100% reliably be able to transmit in that mode. So their strong recommendation is that, given that digital works on digital networks, that is how safety is best delivered for end customers. So I suppose, what is all this about? This is about two things. One, it's about a call to arms for those who haven't already embarked on transitioning their telecare and technology-enabled care services to digital. First, it's a call to arms for them. Secondly, it's a reminder of this, that the reason for transitioning to digital telecare shouldn't necessarily just be about the fact that the analog network is being switched off. Digital telecare services provide a much safer, because the calls are a lot quicker, you know whether the device is connected on the whole, you have a far greater chance of having a high quality speech experience, and there are so many additional well-being services that can be layered over the top. Proactive, discreet monitoring of people's life conditions, all of which can be done proactively, discreetly, and securely in a digital environment, which just isn't possible in the reactive, analog-only world. There are compelling reasons to move to digital, and yet it would seem we are at odds as a sector on how far down that journey we have gone. In any technology change, there is a innovation and distribution curve from the early adopters to the absolute laggards, and it feels like, based on those statistics that the HousingLIN have gathered, that Openreach have gathered, that we are still in that early adopter stage, which would be fine if this was a discretionary transition. But because this is a transition to an endpoint of a retired analog network by all the UK telcos, and an environment where analog will not work well all the way up to that 2025 date. It doesn't mean it will operate perfectly and then end of December 2025 will gracefully shuffle off into the distance. More and more of the network is being digitized as we speak, and every single day, week, month, there is more progress that Openreach and the other UK telcos are making towards a fully digital backbone. So there's no question that there is a compelling reason for change, both because digital is better, is safer, it is faster, but also because the end point is looming at a rate of knots. So there's a couple of things that I think are really worth pointing out. So we believe there is a better level of awareness now, particularly in the housing sector, about that analog to digital transition. And so there should be a reasonable amount of time, provided plans are in place and contracts have been let and there are active discussions underway to engage with end customers. But there isn't, it would seem, a universal approach to that. I presented at a conference that the TSA hosted in Leeds yesterday to a room full largely of commissioners and health care providers for local authorities. And again, there was bewilderment in certain of those authorities about the pace at which this was coming and the significance of the analog to digital conversion, not necessarily meaning that all things work well until that end point. First time call failure, as we refer to here on the slide, is on the increase. It is caused by the analog protocols that were designed for most telecare devices back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, struggling to traverse modern digital networks and therefore timing out. Now, the good thing is they reattempt, but the bad thing is that an analog telecare device, typically, as those who use them will know, takes somewhere between 20 and 90 seconds to connect. So having a first or a second or third time call failure before they eventually do reach a monitoring center. And bear in mind, this is nothing to do with the performance of the monitoring center. This is just the device trying to traverse the hybrid mixture of analog and digital networks that are out there now. That first, second, third time call failure will result in extended times before the call actually reaches the monitoring center. And given the stats we provided earlier in terms of the number of ARCs that are digitally ready, the number of communal living settings that have been migrated, the number of digital alarms which haven't yet had a upgrade or change or iteration to make them fully digitally enabled. Given the scale of the change there, we have to recognize that it would appear as a sector, we are some way behind where we need to be in terms of timescales. There are a couple of things that really brings into sharp context. The first is that if the monitoring centers and the circa 100 or so of them that are only analog enabled at the moment are a barrier, that is a significant factor, considering that on average about 20 a year are getting upgraded, and it takes about 6 months from writing a specification through going through a procurement exercise to choosing to then onboarding and migrating to a new platform. It is at least a 6 months exercise, and we know that because we've been helping a number of organizations with that transition over the recent months. So if we've got 6 to 9 months for monitoring centers to migrate and still 100 of them which are analog only, that is a very, very material hindrance. And then you've got the fact that there is only a finite amount of digital telecare equipment which can be produced. Nobody on this call needs reminding about the global supply chain challenges. So there are a very finite amount of both technical components and also labor. The amount of skilled installers of digital telecare is measured in the small number of hundreds. It's not measured in the large number of thousands. And therefore there is a very, very finite capacity to be able to undertake that work. All of this, I think, points to the fact that we have, as a sector, a real need to accelerate. There are roughly 125 housing sites a month get upgraded, and some of those are still being upgraded to analog systems, can you believe? But it is absolutely true. There are roughly 125 a month getting done, according to industry estimates. And there are roughly 20,000+ that still need some type of upgrade to enable them to be able to operate in an analog to digital world. If you're on this call and you're representing a housing organization or a local authority that doesn't already have a concrete plan, which is underpinned by a supplier who's got proven digital technology and has got resource and stock available, then you risk very significantly running into a capacity crisis. Those sites and individuals who are dependent on the current somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million or so devices which aren't yet proven to be or capable of being operable in a digital world, there is a duty of care risk that is just naturally falling on the organization that you represent. There is only, as I said, a finite amount of capacity to be able to get this done, and the timescale isn't changing. Irrespective of when exactly the analog network, the last elements of the analog network are retired, the transition between here and there over the period, the months ahead, is only making more and more of the open-reach network digital and creating greater risk of first-time call failure. So if you aren't already on that journey and you haven't already locked down your plans, one of the things that is every business's nightmare is being in a scenario where your costs are going up because there is limited choice about equipment. There is only a finite amount of installation capacity or delivery capacity, and therefore you have limited choice and higher costs. That's not a great outcome for end customers or commissioners or housing providers or local authorities. So it is a real call to arms. It's not just a commercial message. Obviously, we are a very biased commentator on this because we are the leading provider of digital solutions, but we can't fulfill all of the industry demand. I mean, much as we love the notion of that, the reality is this is a sector-wide need to transition. And although we have more sites which are proven end-to-end digital, we've handled more calls, we have more case studies than anybody else, we've got more proof points of what a difference digital makes. This is not just Appello who need to be and will be supplying these needs, these demands. It is going to take the whole industry, but it is very important that if you, as I said earlier, work for an organization which doesn't have a concrete plan, which is actually underway, underpinned by budget, underpinned by a supplier who's in agreement that they can meet the timescales, then there is a very real risk that you will have a lack of choice or a higher cost or both of those, which limit your ability to be able to deliver really excellent services. There are some great resources on the HousingLIN website around the analog to digital migration and why there are so many advantages to going earlier rather than later. There are great resources on the TSA, the Tech Services Association website about, again, those same things. Who do you talk to? How do you make decisions? If you don't already have your plans, please, the strong urge so that you don't leave people at risk is to get started sooner rather than later. And by sooner, I mean in days and weeks, not in months and years. That is the main thrust of what I wanted to talk about. I can see quite a few questions pinged in. Jeremy, I don't know whether you want to do those now or hold those to until the other presenters have spoken.
Tim, thanks ever so much, and you've really set out a wake-up call, I think, which is great. In relation to the questions from Isabella and our anonymous, 2 questions now from Isabella and anonymous, would you mind if we hold those back until we've heard from Steve and Kate? And I will certainly pick up with the questions that are coming in into the Q&A box. So that's really important issues that you both raised, but also things that are already coming in. And please don't refrain. I've just had a quick look at our participants list, and we've got some, fabulous contributors who were, experts in the field, both in commissioning, extra care housing, in relation to Telecare, as well as representing the voice of users of services as well. So please do put those questions to the panel. So Tim, very many thanks for that, and you've set out the real challenge. And I was particularly pleased that Steve was able to join us because, for those of you who are joining us, you may not know he looks in a very relaxed mood. He's actually on holiday, and he's taken an hour out of his holiday to join us. And Steve has been working very closely with the TSA to really sort of begin to assess and manage this risk and what it means, both in terms of the TSA's way forward, in terms of the in terms of the codes, the standards, and the like. And I've known Steve for 20 plus years. In fact, even before you became the chief technical officer at Tunstall, I remember some of the early work we did through Telecare with BT. So Tim was talking about OpenReach, and it's one of its offshoots is now OpenReach. We've done a lot of work over the years to try and sort of promote. So Steve, are you able to share? You've already put your slides up. Over to you about thinking about these risks and opportunities, and any comments you may have on Tim's excellent presentation.
No, that's a real good starting point. Thank you, Tim. In fact, we'll probably circle back to a couple of the points that Tim's raised shortly. And thank you for the introduction, Jeremy. Great to see you again. Just to fill in the background, so I've been working with TSA as an associate for around about 5 years. Spent some time working as a research director for Mental Health Trust. And as Jeremy said before that, many years with Tunstall as CTO. So I've been in this sector one way or another for a long time. The reason I've been asked along today by Jeremy was to put some context around that story that Tim's describing there. This is very much an issue of the risk relating to analog to digital. And the question is, how does that risk sit alongside other risks and opportunities that we face with the sector? Is it comparable, and how should we prioritize our actions? So I'm going to try and give you a picture that the TSA has compiled. The first part of this, you will have seen the headline material if you got along to the March conference, TSA's conference, ITEC in Birmingham. And I'm going to try and flesh out some of the hot topics that sit beneath that, if that's okay. Very happy to take questions at the end as well, if Jeremy's going to manage that. So if the slides are going to move themselves along nicely, which they're not at the minute. There we go. So if you were at the conference back in March, you'll have seen material like this, where we had surveyed the sector and looked at the short-term and medium-term risks. If you look at how the majority of your peers, being commissioners, service providers, technology providers in the main, how they saw the short-term risks in this sector, the technology-enabled care sector, short-term being up to 2 years, you'll see the word digital appears multiple times in different contexts here. I'm not going to label this particular slide because we're going to come back to the bigger topics that arise from this, but you'll see top of the list in the short term was just the cost of digital transition, quickly followed by related topics around interoperability, but digital comes up on the list in terms of how good is the offering from existing suppliers, right the way through to is it reliable enough. When you ask the similar questions on a longer timeline, they were described as emergent risks up to 5 years this time. Digital stays around, so people are concerned that this could be a long-lasting problem, but you start to see other risks coming to the fore around co-production, interoperability and integration. And I'm going to just dive into one or two of these now, and as we delve deeper to understand the rationale behind people's thinking on these risks, we can tell a bit more of a story here. Firstly, the key themes. If you put all of that together and try to understand what are the hot topics, We came up with 6. These are they, and I'm not going to bore you with the list here because we're going to dive into each one of those and try and give expose an understanding as to what was behind the topic. But you can see for yourself where people's priorities were here. So let's start with interoperability. And what really was being raised here was the interoperability of technology-enabled care services with health and care services. So there was a view that came out of the survey material that a lot of work done by TSA and others are focused on the internals of Telecare, for example, interoperability of, let's say, sensors with hub boxes or even boxes with ARC software systems. But the issue we exposed here was what do we do about sharing data, services and care protocols with those wider services. And just to give you a tip off at the bottom, on each of these in blue, you'll see what TSA is trying to do about this. In this particular case, is work planned to look at use cases and requirements for interoperability to understand how they fit with our quality standards framework this sector. By the way, the reason this goes back to use cases first and foremost is it really is a big topic. You know, what do we mean by interoperability with health and care here? Is it self-management of our own care, taking our blood pressure readings and responding appropriately, or is it at the other extreme, how do you hand over a Telecare alarm call to 999 services, or help with a discharge from the hospital? There are lots of different use cases with different needs here, hence the requirement to flush out the use cases and requirements. So interoperability, very high on the list. And here's the one we're talking about today. Very highly scored in the list of risks across the sector. And actually across the 2 domains of short and long-term risk, this is the hot topic. And actually, when you lift the bonnet here, there is obviously the risk of simple connectivity as we move to digital telecommunications. But what people were saying was they were concerned that what was being put on the table to replace the analog solutions was too limited in its functionality, probably doing no more in many cases than what we had before, and yet at higher cost. Typically, it was being reported as double the cost with ongoing charges. And in some cases, it was being reported as unreliable. Now, maybe these would all be true because it was early stages in the market development, but it's quite a damning indictment of our state of readiness, which circles back to the points Tim was making. And this is all despite quite a lot of work that happened already. I mean, crikey, TSA's first exposure on this came back to when we were first aware of the concerns. This was back in 2017. And as Jeremy said, we've been talking about these sort of planning issues for new networks even before then. And we need to be aware that some people take the view that we've had a long time to get our act together, and yet we're still talking about pushing headlong into a change in 2024, 2025. So the question is, what do we do about that? And one of the topics that came up in the risk survey was we need new approaches to this, not just do more of the same, more expensively in a digital way. Why aren't we incorporating open consumer technologies in safe ways, reflecting in some cases the views of consumers and carers themselves who seek to adopt the technologies they're familiar with on a day-to-day basis? So a slightly different view on digital there. Let's keep going with the list. This is probably one that was driven to the top by COVID. We saw the emergence of lots of new services during the pandemic, very much outreach services. So they were personalized in nature, reaching out to people who were vulnerable or at risk, making sure they were okay, receiving medication, getting access to food and support. And these new care models created a whole new paradigm for what we were doing in technology-enabled care. And the challenge to TSA and other representative organisations here was, are we providing enough guidance and support as to what good looks like, what safe looks like as we shift to those new models of care? And there is a TSA special interest group working on exactly this topic. But by the way, what I should say is as we go through this, I'll keep referring to the special interest groups, and they're open for you can join those groups. You can contribute to the special interest groups and influence what they deliver in terms of guidance, standards, roadmaps, and so on. You can find those links through the TSA website or contact me directly. If we then switch more from the short-term risks to the emergence, as I described them earlier, what's affecting us all in the 2 to 5 year period, what we saw come right to the top of the list were concerns around co-production. So to paraphrase this topic, it was all around everything we do in terms of services, delivery of technology. To what extent is this designed with the end user, with their families, and with frontline care workers? Are we really reflecting that? And the way the risk was represented here is, will everything we do, will our market and our services within that market, will they be viewed as relevant and purchased in the same way if over time they're seen not to be co-produced with the end user to the same degree? What TSA is doing is it's taking this very seriously. It's working on design principles with one of its working groups. And to link here to TAPPI 2 again, Jeremy mentioned it earlier, those design principles will be run through the test beds and proven within the TAPPI 2 work program. And again, you can find links to that material or maybe come back to it in Q&A. Data. This is an interesting one because I guess ultimately this underpins pretty much everything we do. Unless you have data which itself can be turned into information that we can act upon, that's the key part, of course, then everything falls apart. And the way this risk was expressed is we're probably not doing enough. If we can't exploit shared data, firstly, can we share it in a controlled and consented way, and then use that data to good effect on a personalized basis, or actually as big data to help make our care services more efficient, then we're missing a huge opportunity. And actually this issue of data cuts across all of the work groups, all the special interest groups. So there's a big challenge internally at PSA and with all the membership to see if we're doing enough on these topics around data ownership, protection, capture, and so on. But you'll hear more of that as the next few weeks go by. And then last but not least, there's rather a difficult flip side to all these wonderful opportunities that go with digitization. That's around cybersecurity. Many people, myself included, argue that the old analog world offered a natural barrier here. It's very hard to intercept IP messages when you're dealing with an analog world. You have this natural buffer, effective buffer, and of course we lose that as we shift to digital. And over time we may see external organizations seeking to benefit from that in a fraudulent way. So how do we respond to that? There's already a lot of good material out there on cybersecurity, but we probably need to coordinate that and make it more easily accessible to members of the technology-enabled care community. And TSA is looking at how to engage with all the partner organizations to make that easier for all of us. I really wanted to close by making arguments as to how all these risks fit together and how TSA views the world. Internally at TSA, they all tend to think, and I'm the same, we think of a care model. So at any one point in time, whether that be a view of what end users want or need, or how we can respond in terms of services, how those services could be underpinned by technology, what are the enablers that we bring to make that work, so things like workforce training, leadership training, all these are attributes of a care model of some kind. And TSA is always looking to continuously improve that care model in some way. That usually means new or improved standards or guidance, educational content. And where that comes from, a variety of places, but one important component is the quality improvement program within TSA. And this is where you can all have your say. So there are lots of these special interest groups on various topics. One focuses on analog to digital, for example, one on proactive care, and so on and so on. At any one point in time, there are probably something like 8 or 10 of these active. One in particular, SIG 14, is one that I happen to lead for TSA. And this is one that just looks at continual refresh of what the risks are. I've shared some of that information with you from the last round of risk review. We're just underway with the expert panel and the latest refresh of that to view the sector risks now. In fact, thank you to Jeremy and Kate on this call. They are part of that expert team contributing to that work. And you'll hear more on that during October and November this year, and will be published by TSA. So that's the way TSA sees all these risks coming together and informing and ever improving, continuously improving care model. And hopefully what you found from my little chat here today is a current snapshot view of what, not TSA, but what all of the tech sector members are seeing as their risks. And absolutely, as publicised today, analog to digital is way at the top of the list. And in terms of questions, I think, as Jeremy said, we're leaving those to the end. But happy to take any immediate questions from you, Jeremy, or others.
Well, Steve, thanks. That was a really concise and excellent presentation. I think it followed on beautifully from Tim's. I see quite a few of the questions that come up. There are issues around standards, principles. I see Neil, who spoke at the iTech conference, very much with Clinton on co-production and the work of the Tech Alliance. Again, we're involved with them as well. So I think we will continue the debate, but let's leave the questions till later after we've heard from Kate. But thanks again, Steve, and as you say, Kate and I have been linking into one of the SIGs. So Kate, over to you, and thank you very much for joining us as well.
Thank you for having me. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that's worked.
Yep.
Yeah, good. I see some nods. That's good. Yes, thank you very much for having me. So I'm part of the University of Sheffield, and I have two roles there. One, I'm the digital care lead in the new Centre for Care, and the other piece of work I'm very much involved in is the Impact Implementation Centre, which is about creating change in adult social care. But today I'm going to reflect on some of my research, but I'm also going to draw on research from some of my colleagues in the Information School, which I think will address some of the questions in the comment box around the digital divide and digital exclusion. So the research I'm going to draw on will first speak to the sort of digital switchover and local authority readiness and some of the barriers and challenges they're facing. Then we'll look at some of the benefits and barriers to digital technology specifically, and bring in that work from my colleagues around digital exclusion, and then look at some possible ways forward that we found in our research as well. So firstly, in terms of the first piece of research, this was part of a bigger programme of work funded by the ESRC, and our aims were really to try and look at the challenges adult social care was facing, try and map the existing practice and policy around technologies in care systems, and then explore the potential ways they could be used to produce care systems that are both sustainable but also deliver on well-being outcomes. And we have a number of different outputs: evidence reviews, policy reviews, academic papers, and we did some stakeholder consultations and produced a book. But I'm going to draw on the data specifically related to the sort of digital, analog to digital shift. So in our stakeholder consultations, we were looking at the sort of challenges facing technology-enabled care services, and the digital switchover inevitably came up as a challenge, but also for some local authorities, they very much saw it as a catalyst, an opportunity to think about things differently, to perhaps redesign their existing technology-enabled care offer, to think beyond sort of quite reactive and risk-focused systems, to maybe redesign and pilot new approaches. So some local authorities would describe themselves as prepared, had strategies, had invested in new commissioning of equipment, saw it as an opportunity, were piloting things. We also found some who were not as confident, but were reliant on a service provider to manage that change for them, and saw it as quite a big challenge, but they had a service provider who was going to lead that for them. And then there was another group of local authorities who were kind of playing a waiting game, who were thinking, there's going to be some guidance from government soon, there's going to be some funding from government soon to manage this transition, or there's going to be the perfect piece of technology that's going to deliver everything that all this and adhere to all the safety guidance and guidelines for the analog does. It's going to be perfect. And so there was this sort of reticence from some local authorities to make that switch. And as this quote sort of demonstrates, some were also thinking, well, if we don't have a clear, it's 2025, some of the people on our service, they're going to be on it for less than 2 years. Maybe we'll just wait until as late as possible to transition to digital, which is a little bit worrying. But nonetheless, there was enormous, amongst the sample, digital was sort of seen as a big opportunity, and there was enthusiasm for digital technologies, especially a lot of discussions around the potential of mainstream technologies. And we saw a lot of local authorities piloting Internet of Things devices, smart speakers, wearables, all sorts of different technologies, partly with the rationale that these technologies may already be in people's homes, so they may not need to invest in purchasing them for people. And one local authority described their role as a curator of services rather than a provider in that model. But they also argued that some of these mainstream devices could actually enhance outcomes compared to traditional telecare, which they felt was quite focused on managing risks rather than promoting well-being. And in our stakeholder consultations, we also spoke to care and technology providers who could see the benefits of mainstream devices being quite familiar and user-friendly. And we also spoke to people who use services and their carers who were quite enthusiastic about the potential of mainstream devices as supporting independence and control in a non-stigmatizing and less costly way. There was a real recognition that a lot of the sort of specialist equipment they were using was beige and unattractive and potentially quite costly versus something that everyone has but they're using for to provide care. However, we also wanted to have a deep dive into sort of the challenges around forward planning and the digital switchover. And these are just some of the key ones that came up, and costs was inevitably quite a significant one. There was a lot of hesitancy around what they saw, commissioners saw to be quite a fragmented and confusing marketplace for digital, with lots of startups coming into that space and concerns about longevity and the ability to support at scale being mentioned. Also some frustration from commissioners about their own commissioning cycles. This was also reflected in some of the technology providers we spoke to, that things were slow and inflexible, and trying to get a foothold in a sort of local authority from a technology point of view could be quite difficult because they're sort of almost trapped into quite long-standing contracts with traditional telecare providers. Again, there was a concern over the lack of government guidance on how to do this. There was concerns over standards and safety, and whether what the digital versions of some of the traditional analog telecare would meet those standards, particularly around things like power outages. And even where people were quite enthusiastic about mainstream devices, as has been mentioned by Steve, questions around data governance and ownership and security were raised, but there were some commissioners we spoke to who felt this was kind of, well, it's part of a consumer relationship, and if you already have these devices and we're just piggybacking on them, then that's for the consumer to manage, not us. There was also concerns about a sort of technocentric approach that some local authorities were taking, where they were sort of waiting for that perfect piece of kit, and actually it's very rarely the perfect, it's never just the kit, it's the service wraparound, it's the outcomes you want to achieve, and there was a concern that some commissioners were quite tech focused. And all the stakeholder groups we spoke to said, well, all of these things are quite well and good, digital technology enabled care and specialist products, but also mainstream devices hinge on whether or not people can access them, and the digital divide and exclusion in terms of accessing reliable connectivity, accessing particular devices, skills and confidence to use them were mentioned as being a sort of caveat to that enthusiasm. So I'm going to now turn to the work of some colleagues of mine, which explores the digital divide and digital poverty in more depth. So Efpraxia and Sarah are at the Information School in Sheffield, and they've done a collaborative piece of work looking at digital poverty in South Yorkshire. And what they use the framework provided by the Good Things Foundation, which the most digitally poor people are those who lack basic skills, those who have them maybe in social areas of their life but not for work, those who are disengaged because they're concerned about privacy and security, those who can't afford internet access, and those who can't afford the cost of necessary devices. And I guess another one we can add there is those who maybe can afford all these things, but the connectivity in their area just happens to be poor because of the digital infrastructure in the UK. So what Efpraxia and Sarah did was they wanted to sort of think in depth about areas of digital poverty in South Yorkshire, and they wanted to look at things around low-income households as other barriers to accessing digital. People over the age of 65 have been found to struggle with digital access, minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ groups. So what they did was they created a digital poverty composite index. They used data from various data sources, combined it together to create this index, looking at deprivation, demography, and broadband as the three key areas that affect digital poverty. And what they've created is almost a heat map of South Yorkshire. So from a commissioning point of view, you can play around with this heat map and change all the weightings and have a look and see where are the areas where digital poverty is perhaps most acute. So I'm going to see if I can share this with you. Hopefully it's going to cooperate. So this is the map. So as you can see, you can is that share it? So you've got the ability here to just weight it completely and look at broadband score, which is looking at the ability to connect. So you can, if you're a commissioner of services and you were concerned about the digital switchover, this is another perhaps concern you should also be considering, is which areas of your local authority are least able to access a reliable broadband connection. You can also add then in which are your oldest areas of your local authority, which are your most deprived areas of your local authority, to get a picture of where the digital switchover may be quite a challenging piece of the puzzle. Sorry, I'm just going to switch back to my slides. So that's just a look at Efpraxia and Sarah's project there, and I welcome you to all have a look at that. And it's quite an interesting piece because it can be, it's LSOA data, so any data set you can access that uses that level of granularity, you can plug into that and you can add another layer to that index, and you can also use, if you wanted to create one for another local authority, that's possible too. So thinking about digital poverty and digital exclusion, in our work we also looked at local authorities that were considering this as an issue and were trying to tackle this, and looking at things around equipment loan and gifting schemes, training, peer-to-peer digital courses, those sorts of things. But there were some who were looking at the actual digital infrastructure of their local area and thinking, digital switchover is a challenge, particularly because we have very poor broadband connectivity, we have very poor 5G, 4G signal. So we've got some examples here of Liverpool who created a 5G mesh network in one of the poorest wards in the city, to enable people to connect for free to the 5G mesh network, which allowed you to then use that network for social reasons, for work reasons, for schooling reasons, but also it allowed the care workforce in that area to use that network to connect and do live digital care records, for example. So it could be used for caring ends. Similarly, Norfolk has installed a LoRaWAN network, which you can run Internet of Things devices off as a free resource for people. And both those local authorities were guests on our Digital Care Futures podcast, which we produced in collaboration with the TSA. So anyone who wants to hear more about how they did that, by all means, do have a look at that. And that's really everything I wanted to say. I do have various outputs and links here to all the various sources referenced in this presentation, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, that was fabulous, and I think it sort of brought together some of the key points that Tim raised, echoed and sort of illuminated by Steve, and I think you made it very real, both looking in terms of poverty, exclusion, but also thinking about how to start shaping solutions that are very much focused on the users and the citizen, so the digital citizen. And I'm sure that's something that will come through in some of the questions and queries that we've got coming up now. So thanks ever so much, all three of you, for really excellent presentations. We've got over a dozen or so questions that have come in, which is nearly a record. So please do add to those for those of you who are still with us. And if anything, I think we've probably lost one person over the last hour. So thanks ever so for everybody who's staying on with us. This is a really important subject. I'm going to I don't know whether you've had a chance to flick through some of the questions that have been posted in the Q&A box. But I think I just want to sort of run through those. And Isabella, first of all, talks about a lot of customers are digitally excluded. Again, Kate, you sort of drew attention to that, and there's work happening to mitigate that. How can telecare providers tackle the issue of some customers still not having internet connection? We know that eventually they'll be forced to migrate, but how can we manage this during the transition period? I think, Tim, you just put your finger up. So if I go to Tim first, then to Kate, and then Steve.
Well, I think there's a couple of different things which are at play here. So, for example, in some of the schemes, some of the sheltered housing schemes where we've provided digital telecare solutions, we've provided our smart living solutions, a Wi-Fi hotspot is part of how the solution is able to enhance people's lives. So there is an opportunity, very much so, for digital telecare, digital technology-enabled care services to be the provider, the bridge to the digital divide, rather than than be held back by it. The second part of that, because obviously that relates to communal settings, but there is and will be scope for the same thing to be true in individual settings, so via dispersed alarms, which also have hotspot capabilities, but which use SIM connectivity, because if you have a non-steered SIM, so one that uses all of the or has the option to roam across all of the mobile networks, then that is a inherently potentially slightly safer way, depending on your location, to be able to connect to the network, and you get the bonus potentially of a hotspot as well. So very much, Isabel, I do think that there is a great, well, it's proven, we already do this for some of our customers. So for Housing 21 and others customers, we already use techs as a mechanism for helping bridge the digital divide.
Kate, Steve, anything to add?
Maybe I could just reinforce that point that we do have a solution of sorts there, don't we? In that most of the digital offerings that are appearing for dispersed telecare, as Tim says, are connected over mobile networks. They're SIM enabled. The only unfortunate part about that, on the face of it, that's good news, because that counters the concern that we may not have broadband access into many people's homes. But that then limits you to a digital connectivity to a particular form of telecare and doesn't allow you to access the wider set of technologies that we're all used to in our daily lives. So I think we still need to keep that drive towards broadband connectivity for older and more vulnerable people.
Okay. Isabella also asked a follow-up question. What question should we ask our current suppliers to understand how ready their ARC systems are for digital? I mean, that's a really good one. Steve, do you have any thoughts? Tim?
A simple question is, how many digital telecare calls have you currently taken? I mean, it's a start. It's a starter for 10. Some of it, we've taken millions. Others, over 100 ARCs haven't taken any. But there's a question further on about whether this limits choice or not.
Yeah.
And I think this is an interesting area, that choice may no longer be between those who are the established players, and it might be between a mixture of the established players and new players as well. So, there are some established players who, I've been in the industry now for 5.5 years. They've been talking about, we'll have digital products next year, ever since I've been here, and still don't, as in fully end-to-end digital products. And yet during that time, a number of new entrants have come to the market. So, you know, potentially this is an opportunity for new choice rather than just a limited choice. And I think it may prove to be, as happens in so many different sectors, when there is a pivotal change, then it brings new organizations to the fore, and some, you know, potentially take different paths. So I think new change, different change, rather than there being no alternative. Choice, I meant, rather than change. New choice, different choice, not no choice or limited choice. Anything you want to add, Steve?
I just wanted to link what Tim was saying there back to one of the other risks. Choice is a big issue, and choice also includes mixing and matching. So the issue of interoperability comes back in here. If you don't have interoperability, you're limited to the supply chain of one particular supplier. And it is quite a complex piece, this, end to end, from sensor device to communicating hub through ARC software, possibly onto other solution applications. So we also need that interoperability of supply.
Quite right. Yeah, Kate.
And I guess the other question is whose choice? Are we talking about choice for commissioners to then offer quite a limited range for people receiving commission services, or are we aspiring to move towards an outcomes focused model that some local authorities have opted for, almost a brokerage system where they don't have a direct relationship with one or two suppliers of technology, but they have a broker who can access any technology or any service in trying to deliver the outcomes for that individual. So it is a more of a flexible and personalized approach, and maybe that's the sort of choice we want to see as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes very much back to Steve's point, which is if you start off by choosing products which have the capability to operate in the future with other devices, even if not all of that landscape is clear in an organization's mind, then you've got a platform to be able to build on. If you limit yourself to a manufacturer who has a history of only ever working with their own products, then, you know, quite clearly that future pathway is less feasible. But I think you're absolutely right. There's a question in here, and I think there's one of your early themes in the bits of feedback you got, Kate, was that, well, I'm waiting for the optimal piece of technology. The one thing we all know about technology is it will be slightly better next year. That doesn't mean it's not better now than the crap you've got currently. And it's that, I think that's one of the mindset changes which a lot of organizations need to wrestle with. No IT organization would ever upgrade a PC if it only ever waited for the final version that will happen. There will be better products every single year, and every single year in every walk of life. Nobody would ever buy a car, nobody would ever buy a TV, nobody would ever buy a laptop if you waited for the perfect moment. It is about, is it better? Can I do more with it now? Does it enable a better future living experience, even if I can't envisage it totally? And I really think that comes back to knits all of those points together.
I want to move on to Arla's question from Arla Coventry University. She raises a really interesting point around digital exclusion, but also about, I think it links into the interoperability point, Steve, that you drew attention to. Can kit, whatever that might be supplied along with grab rails by the new ICS and ICBs? And I think that's something that's still emerging. They're still relatively fresh. But I was just wondering whether you from the TSA have looked into this or know of other work that might be related to that.
I think we found some significant gaps there. I mean, remember I mentioned, again, I keep drawing you back to the risk list, but one of the big ones there was around integration with other health and care services. And that could easily be read as some kind of technical integration of data and only that. But what we really mean is exactly this point. We want to provide a holistic proposition here so that the offer is tailored to the needs of the individual. And if that means that you get access to grab rails alongside your new digital alarm product and whatever sensors are appropriate to you, so be it. That should be the integrated package. So how do you personalize and integrate the offer for the individual? And that's an area that TSA believes there are still gaps. There are gaps on guidance on how you achieve that. So work is underway to try and fill that gap.
Yeah, because for me, I think the digital switchover is not just about the social alarms and telecare. It could also be around disabled facilities grants, energy efficiency system, road transport, public transport, anything that has a digital interface. Those significant infrastructure changes will have an impact on service delivery and ultimately the quality of choice that's available for citizens in terms of accessing different public services. And while we've put the spotlight, rightly so, around the telecare, telehealth, broadly speaking, within a housing context, it has a much bigger focus that really is a wake-up call much more generally, not just for our sector. Yeah, Kate.
I think there's also such huge variation across the UK. So there will be some local authorities and ICB and who have been collaborating with health around technology-enabled care for a long time, that hospital discharge inevitably will involve the installation of a pendant alarm. It's hugely variable, and it's even variable for people within those systems as to where their point of access first is with either social health or social care. So we've done research in the past with people with very similar conditions within the same local authority who have very different packages of equipment and support depending on whether they first saw an occupational therapist or they first saw a social worker, because they have different menus available to them of technology. And there needs to be a degree of personalization, but it also shouldn't be a sort of happenstance depending on who you ended up engaging with first in health or in care, or both.
I mean, I think that's an absolute desire and an aspiration, but it's true on every level of social care. It's true on every level of the NHS. The degree to which your service experience depends on your postcode lottery, and I'm not saying it's a good thing or not, but it is one of the bigger things for us as a sector, but more from a government-led initiative to try and determine how much they mandate exactly what the experience will be at every level, in every geography, at every aspect of touching NHS and social care. It is, as you say, it is very, very variable and always has been.
I want to move on. Jerry raises a really interesting point, and it follows on with the comments about Lord Kamal's meeting recently around what sort of support might be available to help local authorities with the transition. I know from a housing perspective, we are waiting not from the DCMS, but we're waiting from the Department of Health for something called the Housing Transformation Fund, which will be aimed for local authorities to really sort of start driving down what new models of care and support are required to deliver better at-home services, and that could be linked to the digitisation fund. But is there anything either of any of you can sort of illuminate on Jerry's point that he makes?
Yep. Certainly, from a provider point of view, it's about flexible commercial offers. This has historically been a sector that has been capital led, and there has to be a budget for a refurbishment of a warden call system, or a budget for a replacement of digital systems. In most aspects of business life these days, it is some variant of pay as you go rather than an outright capital purchase. Most IT, most systems infrastructure is done that way, and I think we and others are already showing that commercial models and commercial flexibility around the payment period, the structure of the commercial arrangement, is the bit we can do to lean in to try and help support.
Steve, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was going to answer along similar lines to Tim, actually, and a good challenge from Jerry. And we did take the simplistic view. We tried that simple capital purchase model up front, and that was something we were able to present back to central government. If you just took the dispersed alarm problem, the 1.3 million users, and we knew that you more or less had to double the cost to go from analog to digital by the time you've rolled in several years of SIM fees and so on. We did play that, and it is a big number. We played that back to central government, but we quickly came to the same conclusion as Tim there, that what you're really looking for is a different commercial model here. And we found it very hard to put numbers around the equivalent challenge in a housing environment where you've got an infrastructure upgrade, and that infrastructure upgrade probably depends on wider upgrades of the housing environment itself. I mean, that might be an area you want to comment on yourself, Jeremy. So we gave a partial answer to central government on that, on the simplistic model is the answer to Jerry, but more needs to be done on those more interesting commercial models.
I think the other thing is, some of the questions here from Michael Chivers and Stephanie Elliott are really critical for business operations within housing association, social housing in particular. Issues around, looking at rent freezes, what that means in relation to service charge rents and capping those, let alone the care cap, rent caps as well. And the other thing is a very big issue in terms of managing risk is the pressure on looking at fire safety and fire regulations within sheltered housing. And obviously there's a link here in terms of smoke detection, sort of looking at heat alarm, etc. Any thoughts that we can, or pointers that we can offer to Michael, etc. Yeah, Steve.
I guess I just want to make the observation that given the pressures we're all under now, the inflationary pressures and cost of living, employment issues and so on, you can very quickly come to the conclusion this is all too difficult. And if you just narrow your focus down to the technology-enabled care sector, you just see it internally as a massive problem, which then obfuscates and delays other things like digital. But I think we need to step away from that and remember that the key issue around technology-enabled care, it's an alternative offer. We really are talking here about helping people to live independently for longer in a different environment and actually not decline into those other settings which are inexorably more expensive. So actually in this challenging environment, we need technology-enabled care. This is going to be one of the key pillars of keeping the economics of our health and social care alive. I think we need to take a positive spin on what tech can offer for the current challenges.
Steve, I could not agree more. I think the whole life cost of digital and the bits that digital touches are the question mark. So, just to take your example of a communal system being X% more expensive in a digital environment, but in a digital environment, I can't speak for everybody's, I can speak for ours, because it's got video capability, because it enables better social inclusion, because it reduces the need to have an on-site presence, because it increases the level of confidence of individuals, then that whole cost of supporting those people isn't varied by the few £1,000s extra it potentially costs to put the system in. It's varied by the whole cost of looking after them, reduced care needs, reduced on-site staff time. The same's true from a dispersed alarm. If a cheap analog system costs 100 quid, or not system, but a cheap analog alarm costs 100 quid, and a digital alarm costs 200, but enables reduced care visits, you don't need many care visits to be reduced at 15 to 30 quid a pop to pay the difference. I mean, you pay for that in months rather than in years. So I think you're absolutely right, Steve. It is not just about the binary, what does analog cost, what does digital cost? It's what is the new model of care, whether that's just a small change or a major change. What is the new model of care that digital enables you to step towards, and how does that influence the whole life cost?
Yeah, I'm going to move on. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we've still got quite a few questions. I'm going to try and bundle up some of these. We've had several which look at issues around standards, protocols, guidance. Any thoughts about this? Should we, I mean, and the TSA are in a sense, the keeper of many of these standards as well. Steve, I mean, I think there was issues here that were raised by Neil Crowther. There are issues raised again, around others, around information technologies, service technologies. You want to just sort of illuminate where we're at currently around some of those standards, and that's outside the TAPPI principles, just to make clear those are principles, not standards.
Sure. I guess what we need to do is avoid diving in too deep here, because we could talk for hours about specific standards. I might want to point people to the work of Special Interest Group number 1, Tim Mulray and that wide team there. And I know Tim's people contribute heavily to that as well. They spend a lot of time grappling with what are the standards and communicating those. So please follow the work of TSA and SIG1 in particular. And you've already seen some commentary in the chat around what digital standards apply to interoperability in both the housing environment UK and digital alarms. So you're probably getting those references. Happy to follow up offline if people want a nice list, or maybe better still link them to the work of SIG1 and Tim Mulray. But there's a whole pile of really supportive information out there already, which you probably don't want to spend hours repeating here.
Yeah, and I think George, who's joined us from UKRI, one of his colleagues is working closely at looking at different British standards, and they've been looking at engaging with the sector as well. So watch this space for what Julia's work at the UKRI might come out with as well. Again, we've got
I would say that I saw one of the points of chat there was around supportive standards, not just the connectivity standards, but what else are we going to do for digital readiness? It might be publicised. There's more material coming out shortly on, for example, what it means to have a reliable monitoring service in a digital world. So watch this space for that material coming out soon. Things like, how do you make the system reliable and available for use?
I think as Irina has just snuck in a question about equipment and how it evolves every year. Does it mean we'll have to upgrade the equipment periodically, like smartphones, because they'll stop working? There was another question earlier about the switch off of 2G. So again, how that relates to any comments on those?
So I've got a couple of very quick ones. So the question about 2G, and this also relates to 3G, is all part of this emerging picture that whatever type of connectivity historically you've depended on, whether it's analog, whether it's mobile based, there is transition taking place, and therefore moving to adaptable technologies is going to be fundamental. So I think that's an important call out. In terms of the replacement cycles of digital products, we don't change our smartphones because they don't work anymore. We change our smartphones because we want a slightly newer model, or because it does better things than the one we had before. A similar situation will exist within digital. You won't be compelled to, well, I can't speak for every manufacturer, but from an Apello point of view, you won't be compelled to move because we're retiring product. You'll be inspired to move because there is something better that changes the way you deliver care and creates a better cost benefit or cost experience for residents.
Thank you. That's great. Kate, there's a question from you just before we sort of begin the closing down. I think it was around some of the data that you had around Yorkshire. Did you see that question by any chance? It's towards the end from Paul. Again, brilliant presentations, really insightful. Was Kate able to share a percentage of stats on the 3 authority segments across the UK? I know we're going to share the slides at a later date, so will they be picked up there, yeah?
Yeah, so the links to all of my outputs are on those slides. It was a qualitative piece of work, so I can't do the percentages. However, I am aware that Farpoint are due to be releasing their piece of work, which was a survey of local authorities looking at digital readiness, commissioned by what was NHS X. Yeah. And that should be coming out very imminently, and they are, this is a plug, giving a seminar for us in October to talk about those findings. So hopefully we'll get that sort of percentages picture on where local authorities may lie in that curve potentially that Tim presented as well, where they are in that adoption curve.
Thanks, and thanks for reminding about that. Yes, that's again another important piece of work that NHS England now and Improvement commissioned originally. Look, I'm conscious we're just at the sort of the cusp of bringing this to a close, but this has been an excellent presentation. I really apologise that we haven't got through a lot more of the questions, but we've done a rapid fire, I think, go at it, and we're going to be trying to do it justice. Kirsty raised issues around, where can we go for consultancy advice and support. Kirsty, you may well now be a consultant as well, and Tim raised his hand, but please do contact the TSA. They are the trade and professional body. If you'd like to have more information and advice from the HousingLIN, we have a technology page on our website too, but ours is predominantly around sharing good practice, learning and information. Josh, you raised this interesting point about wanting to be part of the TAPPI 2 project. I had mentioned at the outset that 6 sites have been selected, but our partners at TSA and are discussing about how we may have a wider community of practice. So keep watching both the TSA and the LIN websites and our regular newsletters for more on that. Give us a bit of time because we've just got the sites up and running, and of course we then had a state funeral this week, so that's had a major impact on bringing all those sites together. The state funeral has had a major impact on the next happy hour session. For those of you who've booked into next week's session with the Archbishop of Canterbury's Commission on Reimagining Care, due to his presence at this week's state funeral and obviously other commitments with King Charles III now, he is unable to be at next week's happy hour, and his team have asked to postpone till a later date this autumn for that Reimagining Care. The launch was due to take place yesterday. It has been held back. We hope it will be taking place in October, November. I would suspect November being more likely, and they are really committed to running a happy hour with us to share the findings from their piece of work. So our next happy hour is on the 4th of October. Please do join us then. You may be interested to know that we're looking at ageing well with assistive technology with a University of Stirling funded piece of work with Stonewater Housing Association, looking not at broadband but low band and narrow band, and looking at low level involvement and technology that can make an impact, particularly around the remodelling of some of their sheltered housing schemes. So many of you have asked questions around that. Please do rejoin us on the 4th of October when we'll be joined by Emma Tobin and Vicky McCall and others from that project. But on behalf of the HousingLIN, can I thank Tim, can I thank Steve, and can I thank Kate for 3 excellent presentations. Thanks very much for supporting this happy hour. Can I also thank the UKRI, who are a sponsor of the LIN, for their support of the happy hours too. And we look forward to working with them and others, promoting a lot of good practice over this autumn. And if you want to sign up to our regular bulletins, please do get back in touch with us, and I'm sure Sally and I are happy to signpost you on how best to access the latest information. Thanks everybody, and I wish you a good evening wherever you are.
Bye everyone. Thanks.
Great session, thank you.